But the idea of group regression is that the group stalemates or fails to work productively or ethically. And the energies get turned to unproductive, destructive emotional expressions, right? So think Tea Party, those people who want to guard the border, war, as unresolved grief for men, xenophobia, things like that. Groups are really preoccupied with boundaries. I used to do these really experiential group things for years, and it's very powerful, a disturbing way to learn about groups, because you really experience it, no matter how much play acting you think it's about. Once a group starts to form, they get paranoid about the boundaries. If we were to do this exercise here, what would happen is people would break off into subgroups, they would find a space, and if you walked into that space and you weren't a member of the original group, they look at you and they go, yeah, what do you want? It's unbelievable. There's this kind of built-in paranoia that we struggle with. Once I've identified with you and you are members of my clique, we're safe. The rest of it. So Freud knew that. Freud said, look, what groups do is they have identifications with each other. It's like a kind of fusion. We feel we're alike and we're one. And then we project our aggression out. And we're all happy with each other. Until bad stuff happens. We break off into subgroups. Benjamin Franklin used to say that. He used to say, look, all human history is the following. A bunch of people get together against another group, and they form stuff, and they succeed, and then they start arguing with each other, and they form subgroups, and it starts all over. Which is true. We saw it in the United States. The founding fathers began to argue with each other, and they became two parties. In the beginning, they felt we don't need a party system. In fact, it was sort of seen as unethical and sort of out of bounds that they could be party. And then they split up. They started to argue with each other about, guess what? Same stuff we argue about today. Individualism versus community. Same argument. So Freud was onto it, and he also said that the leader serves the function of representing our ego ideal. George Bush was not my ego ideal, but it was somebody's. Florida. But think about it though. If someone becomes president, the majority somehow of the society, or a huge portion of the society, sees them as some kind of hero. And this person's it's almost demigod kind of stuff. One of the things I thought I saw in the first social dreaming event we did in July was a search for a Moses-like leader, which is what some people have suggested is what Americans want in a president. They want a lawgiver. So when you think about Bush and his direct connection to God, you kind of get that. Ironic name, right? And then when you think of Obama, constitutional lawyer, an expert on law and all this stuff, and it kind of has that kind of oratory that's Moses-like. It's what we want. We want really amazing leaders that will do God-like kind of things. So Freud was right about that. Freud had some other weird notions about groups, which I will not share with you. He thought that the primitive group, for example, that's the Oedipal complex, that the young people in the group had killed the father, and that's why he had this guilt. Some very strange ideas. But Bion, who was actually influenced by Melanie Klein, has developed the most productive group theory. He felt that all groups are struggling with anxiety. And then what happens then is, under certain conditions, they regress. So what you'll find is any group that's involved in a task, there are always these really weird unconscious currents going on. Effective leaders know that. They're in touch with that. And they're able to, some leaders are paranoid and they're actually able to play the group based on understanding that. They're very narcissistic leaders. But effective leaders know that. They sense that, and they find a way of harnessing these regressive energies in a productive way. So a teacher, for example, will use children's dependency in a way to empower them and to help them move on. So what Bion posited was there were three basic assumption groups. So there's a group unconscious, and groups begin to somehow connect with each other unconsciously and have a relationship with the leader in the following way. So he says, look, one type of group is they get into fights. They decide that the world is a hostile, dangerous place, and we have to declare unilateral war on some people, right? fight-flight group. And there are groups, and Bion gave examples of this, like the military and so on. He then posited that there was a dependency group culture. So these are groups that get together and they feel that they can't do anything, that they're helpless, and they have to get help from somebody. And you see this. You've probably all been in groups where you hear this. You go, they're just moaning and talk about how they need something and they can't get anything, and they're helpless. Then he had what he called a pairing group. In the pairing group, there is this sort of hunt. The group begins to see if they can identify a pair that they can make into a king and a queen. So there's this hunt to find leadership, and this edible mating kind of fantasies in the group, that kind of thing. So they're kind of looking for parents. More contemporary thinking, we've added two more assumptions. One of them was added by one of my mentors, and he has a very weird sense of humor. He calls it the Miss Piggy basic assumption. Everybody familiar with Miss Piggy? Mm-hmm. So his view is, he developed this actually with Gordon Lawrence. Gordon Lawrence was an organizational consultant and group specialist as well. And, he's the guy who developed social dreaming. Their view is that there are certain groups that pretend to be a group. And you even hear lots of slogans around teamwork, group, or a work group, or one organization. So, but what's really going on, they call it, it's basic assumption moi. It's really about me. And so there's really this really weird narcissistic compartmentalization going on. Guess what system they said that applied to most appropriately? Most what? What system would you would say this applies to? This is a pretense that it's a group, and now we're a team.
Competition, the whole political party system.
Interesting. Like the Congress, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good example, yeah.
Work groups or corporations?
Some corporation. The example they thought was sort of the paragon was academic institutions.
Yeah, definitely.
You run into that?
Yeah, I think
There's
particularly in higher
this weird
education.
fiefdom, right? Silos and
The tenure process, all of that
yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
I mean, I have some patients, and they really struggle with because they're interdisciplinary, and they can't understand these damn systems because nobody wants to hear them. These people do not talk to those people and have a different language and stuff. The other basic assumption is fusion. So there are groups, and you see this in cults. There are groups that get together, and their sort of driving motivation is to fuse. There are mesh systems that do not tolerate any difference, and they have fantasies of somehow being fused together, to drinking the Kool-Aid together. Beyond's notions are extremely you find, I learned a great deal using those ideas and experiencing in the groups. And what happens is, if you are struggling with that group culture, they will toss you out. It's very hard to struggle with. There's like a contagion and an amplification of this unconscious process. And sometimes you feel yourself going. I've sat in groups where I go, what's going on here? I don't get it. You're acting like they're the CIA. I don't belong there. I've been in very narcissistic groups that are constantly ambitious. We're going to get bigger and stronger, and we're going to do great things. And I'm going, but look at the flaws we have. I'm in the wrong group. I don't know. So let me just tell you a little bit about these contemporary ideas. People's behavior is always structured by their role in the group. And they'll push you into a certain role. The group is looking for certain roles to be met. And then what happens beyond said is, because of your own personality and your own history, you may have a valence for this particular group. Like in chemistry, and you get attached and you wind up playing a certain role. So of course that happens to marginalized groups. They get to play a certain role in the larger societal framework. And we have to struggle with that. I just read a wonderful quote from Thomas Sauce, the famous anti-psychiatrist. He said, in the animal kingdom, the sort of overriding principle is eat or be eaten. He says, in the human kingdom, it's define or be defined. Very interesting. the struggle is around getting to define and construct your sense of identity. And in fact, I have an academic now who's struggling with that. Right? I hear what she's struggling with. It's really about struggling with self-delineation and saying, this is what I believe, this is where I stand. She's experiencing a fair amount of racism in the institution. The group's behavior is structured by the task that it's given itself, or someone else has given it, and its unconscious need. Groups are always anxious. I mentioned that about their boundaries. They need to be well defined. Leaders are always essential to groups. Groups are always searching for a leader. What I've loved about Obama is that he refused to accept the projections into him of the guy who's going to save everything. You know how he always talks about how we're going to do this together. It's a wonderful example of leadership that's collaborative and gets these processes of dependency. So, we expect Washington to have all the answers for us. He struggles with that. Washington has some of the answers, but not all. Now, what groups do is they'll search out people for that leadership function they need for their regressive stuff. The leader has to be aware of that because they will then shape the leader if the leader's not aware of it. They manipulate the leader, essentially. And of course, we believe that we are wired to cooperate. So, we have both these parts of our, species inheritance. As Jung was trying to point out to us, is this complicated inheritance where we are extremely cooperative. It's the only way we've survived as a species, but we're extremely paranoid and destructive. So we see it in our, Western religion. We have these images of God, it's great and wonderful. And then guess who we have at the other end? Lucifer. So it's this constant dialectic that we're projecting out in our archetypes, and the way we see the world. All stories. You go to see any movie, it's a good guy, bad guy, and a gun. That kind of thing. Infant research supports it. Infants very early on can read intentionality in adults. They begin to offer help to explore that. So are we out of time?
We have a few more minutes.
Okay, so let me just talk about race. I'm going to talk a little bit about leadership. I'm in the process of inviting Dr. Veronica Abney. She's a local black analyst. She's done some interesting research. She decided, which is an idea I had as well, I'm in training at the Institute of Contemporary Psychoanalysis. I think I'm getting myself it's a big joke in my family. I think I got a second doctorate on the couch years ago, and I got a third one working in the community. But they were actually confer a real doctorate on me. What Veronica has done is extraordinary. She decided that we know that there are few black analysts. There are probably even fewer black patients. Someone said there are about 50 black analysts in the whole country. It's crazy. Absolutely crazy.
Yeah, 50.
So she started out, she said, I'm going to find them and I'm going to interview them and find out what their experiences are. Right? So she goes to the major analytic organizations, the American Psychoanalysis, they don't have a clue. They don't have a clue. They can't look at it. It's unbelievable. They're invisible. So she starts doing it informally through people she knows. Like I know, for example, I know a handful of black analysts. One of them was my analyst. So once you begin that, you start, she says, I discovered quite a few of them. And she began to interview them, how they got into analysis, what their class background is very interesting, what their training with their MDs, PhDs, social workers, and so on. The early black analysts, there were very few of them, usually MDs, and they come from the upper middle class. Usually their parents were MDs as well. That's changed. We see more PhD black analysts. But one of the reasons I wanted to come here is because she showed the videotape that was so disturbing. And this is primarily a white audience when I was there, and there were a few blacks in the audience, a couple of black analysts, and some black graduate students, but mostly white audience. It was very disturbing for people to see this videotape. The videotape was I don't know what to call it. It was sort of a conversation symposium in an academic setting where the famous analyst Greenson Greenson, by the way, was Marilyn Monroe's aunt. He's very famous. He was like the man in psychoanalysis. He wrote a big fat black book called The Technique of Psychoanalysis. This guy, at every meeting, he would get up and give, 15-minute speeches extemporaneously because he was really so, but he saw himself as this big liberal. So he sponsored the first black psychoanalyst in the United States. He was trained right here in LA. So 20 years, this is like in the 50s, right? 20 years later, this videotape documents this conversation about the analysis. This black analyst was an analysis with him. And so the black analyst is there, and he's there. First thing, he tells this guy, who's not a college, this is 20 years later, this guy has gray hair, he's college, he's no longer a student. He says to him as he goes into this conversation with students, don't contradict. And then you see the body language. Greenson can't stop talking, and black analyst is sitting there basically like this. What's going on? And then Greenson begins to talk about how wonderfully liberal he is, how he sponsored him, and how much he learned about black life, and things he didn't know, and black sexuality. And he goes on to talk about how, God, I didn't know this. He would drive to my office in Beverly Hills, and he would tell me that the police would stop him, and I didn't believe it. And how naive of me, and of course, as black analyst, I would say to him, I'm not paranoid. It's you white folks who are paranoid. You keep stopping me every time they come. So they would spread evil and crap like that. Oh, wait. But you have to see this. So I'm hoping Veronica brings that videotape here. Because if you see this, it is unbelievable. It is so disturbing and embarrassing to anyone. This was liberal psychoanalysis. And you can understand then why there are so few black psychoanalysts and fewer black patients. It's extraordinary. The enormous gulf and stereotypes, and just incredible, right? And there are horror stories of people who were black and tried to get trained in how to treat themselves. Call it from her to do and stuff. My hope is she's agreed to do it. We just have to find a time and place and some money. She's going to publish it at some point. Yeah.
Greenson is also, I don't know if this is true, but you might know, he's infamous for actually taking Marilyn home.
Yeah. No, he would take her home for dinner. He would have his children escort her around town.
Yeah, she lived with him.
She lived with him.
Because
he would talk to the studio heads. It was like the studio heads owned Marilyn Monroe, and they were telling him what to do. Get her together because we need her for a movie next week. That kind of weird, crazy stuff. The boundaries were just crazy. She actually bought a house that was a replica of his house. So identified. It's sad. Granted, she was a very, fortunately very damaged human being. So let me just add one little thing about Black Dreams. There's a wonderful book called Dream Singers. The African American Way with Dreams. It is a great book. It will give you insights about dreaming and about blacks and understanding black culture. Michael Adams, a Jungian, has written a really interesting book, actually, Multicultural Imagination. There's a paper that I recommend. I actually have a copy of it. You might have it now. It's actually Michael Adams, Benoit Adams' paper on African American dreaming.
The Beast of Racism.
This is called, yeah,
I have that.
yeah.
I can send it
you
over.
get that to folks and stuff. Really interesting paper. This black patient, a woman who's an academic, she has a dream that she is, and the words are crucial here, that she's trying to pass through two mansions. And the first mansion, there's a lion in her way, and she asks for help, and there's a very kind white person who helps her. And that mansion she approaches through the front door. The second mansion, she's rejected and she has to go through the back, and then she finds that there are all these animals blocking her way. She asks for help again, and there are two figures, a man and a woman, white. The male, I think it's a male, one of them gives her a stick and says, well, beat up the animals, beat up the beasts. She says, I don't want to do that. They say, well, we can't help you, basically. And she's stuck. She can't get past this mansion. Adams does a really interesting analysis. He says we can look at this at the cultural level and at the archetypal level. At the archetypal level, the lion always represents power, right? And he hooks it up with Heracles and Hercules. And Hercules discovered that the Nemean lion he could not beat with weapons. He was stuck. We talked about stuckness. So, does anybody remember? Maybe we're all into mythology, right? Hercules strangles the lion with his bare hands. And this is a pretty mythic image. Who else did it? Samson does it too. Samson takes the lion and rips his jaws up and stuff like that. Now, what Adams says is there's something very interesting going on in this dream. It's at multiple levels. This woman has some personal issues around assertiveness and so on, but then there's this cultural stuff about the mansions representing academic institutions. But also cultural stuff with the mansions representing plantations. And then the issues of passing as white and so on. And then she in her own personal history had, her way was blocked in one of these institutions. The second mansion represents that. But the other interesting symbolism is the stick. He says this is very interesting because this is a struggle that American blacks have had, whether to use violence for liberation, and throwing off oppression, racist oppression, or the way of Martin Luther King. Malcolm X, by any means necessary. So the stick would be Malcolm X versus nonviolent. Adams proposes a third way, and this is very interesting because I was reading some work by what's the guy at Harvard, the famous black. Gates. Gates. I read Gates' dissertation, and in Gates' dissertation, he proposes that throughout African American culture, there is the unconscious image of the trickster that comes from an African god. And Adams proposes that that's the third way that African Americans have survived. Malcolm X, right, Martin Luther King, or the trickster. He proposes this to her. She says, I can't do that. That would be too manipulative, being a trickster and trying to do this and build relationships and do that kind of stuff. I'm a Christian and I will do it. It's very interesting. So she struggles with all three ways, except, she really is saying, I'm committed to the way of Martin Luther King, but it costs her. Because she doesn't use her assertiveness or her power because she thinks it's too cruel. It's unchristian.
Well, I was going to say that there's a book, I'm not sure if you've read her, Dr. Joy Leary, talking about post-traumatic slave syndrome.
Oh, yes.
And she's very powerful. She goes around and she talks about how we're still living with slavery, and that's the symptoms that we're seeing within the African American culture and so forth. So I think she's very poignant in this, the issues and topics that she brings out as far as. I couldn't agree with you more. So yes, it's very interesting.
It is. I mean, it's very similar. I've come to the view that every time we talk about any of these group differences, whether it's race, gender, sexual orientation, we're really talking about trauma. And we're really talking about historical trauma that we've all inherited and we're all part of. I would recommend that you read the work of Claude Steele. He's the guy who developed this idea of stereotype threat. His latest book is called Whistling Vivaldi. It's a beautiful book. He shows in the book, it's called Whistling Vivaldi, by the way, because it's a story he heard from a black student. He's a black graduate student in a mostly white campus, and he says that one day he was walking behind a white couple, and he realized he was scaring them, so he started whistling Vivaldi and reassured. The trickster, I'm telling you, it's the way people have learned to survive. I mean, I used to do that in New York. I used to walk down the street and I go, ooh, these people are going to be frightened. I walk across the street, particularly when I was a teen. Start clutching their belly. I'm convinced then of what Claude Steele has discovered. He's discovered, he's spawned now a bunch of graduate students and collaborators all over the world. They've done this stuff in France, you name it, with language and class. What they found was But if you put people in any situation where they're going to be assessed, and you just drop a hint that you're kind of paying attention to some social identity of theirs, the performance goes on, including white men. It's extraordinary. We are all living with some kind of internalized stereotype about ourselves. We have all been traumatized. It's extraordinary. So historically, we've learned it. We've heard it from our parents, our grandparents, our uncles, our cousins. I did the genogram with my mother and to find out what her history was like. Things we don't know about our parents and what we've inherited procedurally, because they're letting us know non-verbally about them. Things that are encouraging and discouraging. So I'm done. Thank you.